Welcome everyone to another in the Information Ecology lecture series. We're extremely lucky today to have our local colleague, Koleman Strumpf, to come and join us. Koleman is a professor at UNC. He works in economics. He's written on such things as the predictive power of betting on presidential elections and sports betting, and also on the economics of illegal behavior in sports betting, and also on some regional and local economics. But he's probably best known for injecting himself into the music wars fray quite recently. As you know, starting with the Napster controversy and going forward through Grokster, Kazaa, and the other peer-to-peer networks. The file sharing, music file sharing, has been one of the biggest issues that has actually shaped copyright policy and law, and has also been the result, has also caused a number of civil suits, one of which recently wended its way to the Supreme Court. For a lot of reasons, the issue of economic damage here was very important. It was important as a matter of copyright law because there were really two ways in which copyright law could look at file sharing. It could look at it as some tendencies had done to say that private behavior, which was not done for commercial purposes, was presumptively non-commercial, thus that there was a presumption against market harm, and therefore if you wanted to show that there was actually not a fair use, the burden was on the record companies to show that there actually was market harm. On the other hand, there was a different way of parsing it, some tradition which had already existed in the law, but which achieved much more prominence in the wake of the peer-to-peer file sharing suits, which was to view commercial behavior as getting for nothing something that you would otherwise have paid for, and which tended to elide the question of market harm. If you did get to the issue of market harm, all that we really had until quite recently were a series of guesses. People saying, well, I think it would really help it. I mean, it's a matter of common sense. Other people saying, well, I don't think it would because I went out and bought a CD because I originally heard something on Napster, and what was really missing was empirical evidence. And Professor Strumpf's co-authored study was one of the most important ones in that debate, and one that I think, as he'll tell you, was received with some consternation and perhaps even hostility on the part of the music industry. So I'll turn it over to him. Koleman Strumpf, thank you very much.
Thanks, Jamie. Okay, so I think, again, I want to thank you for having me here. I appreciate being able to come down the street and give a talk here at Duke. To give you a sort of sense of the big picture about what I want to talk about today, I think Jamie pretty much covered most of this already. I'm going to be talking about file sharing, which I won't be very specific exactly what I mean by that, but just in sort of broad terms, thinking about the free exchange of digital files across the internet. And the sort of big legal question, as Jamie mentioned, is that these networks, which have sort of risen in importance over the last 5 years or so, have weakened the control that copyright owners had over their product. In particular, the fact that on networks like Napster and Kazaa, and now things like BitTorrent, one of the primary things that are exchanged are things like music and movies. And so that suggests I think, relatively important policy question. Maybe it's necessary because of this new technology to provide new powers to the intellectual property owners to help offset this loss of control. And I definitely won't be answering that question in its entirety, but I'll answer, I think, one component to figuring out whether that's a good idea or not. And that's to think about what the economic damages are from file sharing. And again, as Jamie had mentioned, some people view this as an obvious point, and they know for sure what the answer is. I'll try to suggest some reasons why, at least, it's not completely obvious that file sharing necessarily leads to economic harm. It's also important, I think I should stress, given this is the law school, that I'm definitely not an expert in legal issues. So I'll tell you only, I think, I'll try to stay as focused as I can on what I know about, which is the numbers. And I hope that'll provide either some context or some framework for those of you who are much more informed about these important sort of legal issues. In particular, what I'll be talking about is some of my research about how file sharing has impacted two kinds of industries that are very prominently featured on these file sharing networks, the music industry and a little bit about the movie industry, though that's kind of somewhat preliminary work, but I'll tell you what we've done. The research that I'll tell you about, to the best of my knowledge, is the only research that studies, it's based on what people actually download on file sharing networks. So most of what we know about how file sharing networks influence the real world are based on sort of two kinds of information, at least up until the study that I'll be telling you about, and that's either looking just at broad aggregate data, which I'll talk a bit about in a few moments, and also surveys. And I'm sure a little bit of introspection tells you that surveys are probably not the best kind of evidence to look at when you're asking people about a behavior that they potentially can be prosecuted for. So it's probably better to look at what people actually do, rather than what they say they do. And so if you happen to be interested in more of the details about this work, they're available on my webpage. And this is all based on some joint work with a co-author of mine, Felix Oberholzer, who's at Harvard Business School. So to begin, I think it's important to mention what the basic case that has typically been given for why most people, at least initially, thought that file sharing led to economic damages. And I'll talk a little bit about music and a little bit about movies. So the case with music, I think, is pretty straightforward. The music industry's had a tough several years, at least since around 1998 or 1999. Shipments of music have fallen pretty dramatically. I'll come back at the end of the talk to why I use the word shipments rather than sales. And right around this time was when Napster began, which was sort of the first large file sharing network. So a lot of people like to draw this connection between, well, when the music industry starts to have trouble, that's right when file sharing kicked off. With Hollywood, the story isn't quite as clear, and it's a little bit more recent. So Hollywood actually hasn't suffered quite so dramatically recently as, or hasn't really had particularly bad times until last year. Last year was a really bad year for Hollywood. In fact, box office revenues fell by about $500 million, and attendance was down about 7%. It was also the first time in quite a while that home video spending, this is like rentals or purchases of DVDs, fell for the first time in 25 years. Again, at the same period of time, file sharing continued to grow. And the number, for example, of users of file sharing networks in the United States went up by about 25% during this period. So again, people like to draw this inference that as Hollywood is having troubles, file sharing is getting more popular, perhaps there's a connection between the two. It's also important to note that pretty much most of what you would be looking for or going to the movie theater to watch or to rent, you can actually download pretty readily in a legal fashion today. So just to give you a sort of sense, those of you who aren't sitting around doing file sharing all the time, this is some numbers I put together from about 2 weeks ago that shows you, in terms of English language movies, what were the most popular downloads. So let me just point out a couple things. The second column shows you the particular movies that were quite popular. And if you happen to like movies, you'll see that those are all things that are currently right out in the movie theater or things that have recently been released for DVD. The other thing you'll notice just in the third column is that the number of times these things have been downloaded is pretty large. So for example, The Lord of War, which is a movie that just came out on DVD, had been downloaded 1 million times in about the week that this movie had been available on file sharing networks. So again, the sort of prima facie case is that Hollywood's having some troubles. It seems like it's very easy to go out and get these movies on file sharing networks. And a lot of people seem to be doing it. But again, returning both to the case of music and movies, it's actually not quite as obvious as you might think. And there's at least a couple reasons to be a little skeptical of the evidence that I just put up. In terms of music, one reason you might want to be skeptical is the intuition is just not quite so clear. It's not simply that people would necessarily go to file sharing networks, download a song, and then not go out and buy it. There's at least two important factors to think about. The first one is that it's possible that people could use file sharing networks to learn about new music or even sample new music, which might even lead them to buy more music. And the second thing, and probably the more important point, is to think a little bit more deeply about what file sharing is. File sharing is something where you have to sit at a computer, waste a little bit of time to download something to save $15 to $18. Well, that's an activity that's very attractive to people who have a lot of time on their hands and not a lot of money, like kids. Well, it's not obvious that people who would engage in that kind of activity are people who would have, in the absence of file sharing, gone out and bought the CD. So it's not at all obvious, at least, that every download should be thought of as a foregone sale. And the second piece of sort of counter evidence to think about is the fact that this aggregate data can be thought of in different ways. In particular, in like the music business, like any kind of entertainment industry, is really driven by fads. And as a result, the industry oftentimes sees large reductions in sales that have absolutely nothing to do with things like technology, but probably have something to do with changes in taste. So let me just show you a figure that shows you the revenues for the record industry in the recent period and then in a slightly older period. So the red line shows you the revenues for the record industry in the current period. It has a peak in 1999, and then it falls, as you've probably seen if you follow this kind of stuff in the newspaper. The blue line shows you for a similar time period the record industry revenues for an earlier period, around 1978. And you'll see that music revenues fell much more significantly than they fell in the current period. Now, again, I was a little bit too young at that point to remember, but I don't think that what was going on in this period was file sharing. It was most likely due to the fact that there was a change in taste of what people liked in terms of music and the sort of lack of finding the new replacement. So with music, it's not quite so obvious exactly that there's a clear link between the two. With movies, the story's a little bit more complicated, but you can, again, sort of cast doubt a bit on sort of this conventional wisdom. And that's thinking a little bit more closely about how the movie industry makes their money. Well, at least in terms of what goes on at the box office, most of box office revenues for movies, particularly big movies, comes in the beginning. So almost half of revenues from movies come the first week after the movie's released. So if it's true that people are going, downloading like crazy in the first week, maybe we think there's a link between these two things. But that's actually not quite what happens. While I just showed you that you can actually typically find a movie that's recently released on a file sharing network, I didn't tell you what quality movie you can get. And in fact, typically, when a movie is released, the first version that hits a file sharing network is a movie that's shot on a camcorder, which is really low quality. I don't know if you've ever seen one, but it's basically distorted image and not really high resolution. You usually don't get the high quality DVD type movies for about 1 to 2 weeks after the movie comes out. So to show you a little bit more specifically, this is what this would look like if you happen to have been interested in the movie War of the Worlds over this summer. War of the Worlds came out, at least in a wide release, on June 29th. And if you were an intrepid file sharer person and want to get this movie on the 1st of July, this is what you would get. And as you can kind of see from the picture, the image is distorted. You can't see almost anything. I also didn't show you a scene, but you oftentimes see somebody standing up and blocking the camera. It's really pretty bad. It wasn't until a week later that a relatively high-quality version of the movie actually came out. So with that kind of as a backdrop, what is it that I do in my research? Well, the research first thinking about music is, and the research I'll talk about with movies is pretty similar, is we look at what people actually download. And in particular, we're going to analyze a very large database of downloads, almost 2 million downloads of music files from the end of 2002. And we ask, I think, we analyze this data, I think, in a relatively straightforward fashion. In other words, the music industry arguments are that file sharing leads to reduced sales. Well, if that's true, we might expect that albums that are downloaded more heavily would see a greater reduction in sales. So that's basically taking the record industry reasoning and just putting it right out there. There's one important issue in the statistical analysis, which I won't at all go through here, but I think it's just important as a matter of to mention. And that is, if you were to look at downloads and sales, you'd see that people tend to both download and buy the same kind of stuff. They buy the very popular or download the very popular stuff. So today, people are going out and getting things like Kanye West CDs. They're buying them and they're downloading them in very high numbers. So if we're interested in drawing a causal relationship between downloads and sales, we have to do a little bit more digging. And so in particular, what we need are factors that influence downloads but don't directly influence sales or wouldn't directly be related to sales. And just to give you one example of this kind of stuff, and if you're interested, the paper goes through this in unfortunately excruciating detail, is song length. Okay, so it turns out that particularly in 2002, when broadband wasn't quite so common, bigger songs that were longer in time length, would have a larger digital file, which would take longer to download. So all else equal, albums that had long songs would have fewer downloads than albums with fewer short songs. And that turns out to be true. And there's lots of other examples of this that we look at. Before telling you what we actually found, let me just mention at least one broad fact about this data, because as I said, to the best of my knowledge, I don't think anyone else really has extensively looked at this kind of download data before. And one of the things I was actually quite surprised with was that despite the fact that if you've ever gone on a file sharing network, you'll see that you can download pretty much anything that you'd ever want in terms of music, that's not really what people download. What people download are basically radio hits. So for popular albums, what's downloaded are the top 1 or 2 songs on any album. Almost nobody goes out and downloads every song on an album. Now, I don't want to push this too hard, but at least right from the beginning, this suggests to me that there might not be a lot of crowd out between file sharing and sales. In other words, if the people who go to file sharing networks are the sort of people who are only interested in 1 or 2 songs per album, then it's not obvious that those are the people in the absence of file sharing, this kind of counterfactual that I think we're interested in, who would actually have gone out and spent $18 to buy one of these albums just for 1 or 2 songs. Well, in terms of the actual analysis, which again, if you're interested in the details, are in this paper that's up on my webpage, we don't really find much of an effect. And there's sort of 2 ways of saying that. One way is saying, what's our sort of best guess as to the magnitude of this crowd out? Well, in the sort of worst case scenario that we could find, and we really torture this data pretty hard to come up with as extreme an effect as we could find, we find a crowd out of less than 3 million album sales in 2002, which, to give you a sense of the magnitude, that's less than 1% of industry sales. So we don't really find much in terms of a crowd out effect. And in fact, we also find that file sharing might even be somewhat beneficial to lower selling artists, perhaps reflecting some of this learning I'd mentioned before. But I think a better way of thinking about what our results are is what an economist or a statistician would say, what hypotheses can we test? Or maybe in terms of, from a legal context, what kind of statements could one testify if one was presenting this evidence in court? In other words, with conviction, what can one say? Not just what's your best guess, but what specific statements can you say are true or not true? And we can look at 2, I think, kind of polar opposite cases. On the one hand, we can look at the hypothesis. Can we ever say that, can we reject the notion that file sharing has no effect on sales? And in fact, you cannot reject that hypothesis. Alternatively, you can reject the hypothesis that even 1/4 of the sales reduction that actually occurred in 2002 was due to file sharing. And so our conclusion from this analysis is that we don't believe from this that file sharing was responsible for a majority of the loss of sales. Now, originally, Jamie was correct in saying this was something that was particularly controversial. I have a rather large stack of correspondence, and I don't think I saved too many phone messages that people who weren't very happy with this result. But the record industry, I think, has recently been singing a very different tune about this. If you noticed, if you were sort of a careful reader of The Economist, you would have seen about a year ago they had an article where they mentioned an internal label study that basically concluded the exact same thing that we concluded, that file sharing is not the main culprit behind the reduction in sales. Now, I've tried very hard to get a copy of that study, but have been unable to, and I don't think the record labels are very happy with me, so I don't think I'll see it anytime soon. If you also follow the record industry and their statements more recently, when they go out and give statements today, they actually now no longer argue that file sharing is the main culprit behind what's going on with their industry, but rather point to another kind of strong, well, another possible explanation, CD burning. Okay, So that's music. What about movies? Now, we're going to also do the same kind of analysis that we did with music by looking at a large database of downloads of movies. We're going to look at, if you happen to be a sort of file sharing aficionado, of information from something called the BitTorrent network. And one of the things that we have, or what we basically have, is we observe the number of downloads on an hourly basis for basically every movie that anyone in the world is downloading. And we observed this for about 2 years. So we have lots and lots of data, which is one of the reasons we haven't finished our analysis yet, because there's a lot of it. And we're going to look at we do the same kind of research strategy, thinking about whether movies that have more downloads see a greater reduction in sales. And so what is it that at least we found initially? Well, the preliminary results in some ways echo what we found with music, though not quite. We do find that in terms of box office, there is some crowd out between downloads and box office revenues. I think the intuition relates to some of what I'd mentioned before, that at least up until recently, when you went out to go download a movie that's freshly out in the movie theater, you're going to get a relatively low quality version. And that's probably not a very good substitute if you're really interested in seeing the movie. But there's also one other point that I should mention. And that's what actually happens when everybody goes out to download that one copy of a good movie that's out there. So let me just briefly point out what's going on in this picture. Just focus on this top line here. And this shows you the downloads of the movie Lord of the Rings 3, or I guess that's Return of the King, basically when the first good copy of it came out. And the movie was released on the 17th of December in 2003, and about 4 days later, the first copy came out. And perhaps not surprisingly, you see this huge surge in people who want to go download this. The reason that's relevant is when you have thousands of people trying to go after one copy, not everybody doesn't really get very much. And in fact, in this particular case, it took the first person who actually fully downloaded this movie, it took a week after this thing was released on the file sharing networks before anyone actually got it. So in fact, nobody got this movie till the 25th of December, which is over a week after the movie came out. So that's one reason why we might think that file sharing hasn't had much of an effect on box office revenues, though in the future that might change as the sort of technology of file sharing improves. It turns out that home video, so like rentals and sales of DVDs, is actually a much larger component of what Hollywood does. It's between half and 2/3 of revenues for Hollywood. So looking at that is actually much more important. And here the effects are even weaker, where we actually find a very small negative effect of downloads on rentals and almost no effect on sales. So what is it to wrap up? Well, let me wrap up and then make one sort of last point. So we don't really find very much evidence that file sharing has had an effect on movies, though, again, with the important caveat that this might change as file sharing technology improves. Perhaps what I can say with a bit more conviction is that file sharing, or sorry, I'm using the acronym P2P for peer-to-peer, doesn't seem to have significantly impacted the record industry, at least for the period 2002 where we have information. And that, of course, begs the question, well, the record industry definitely seems to be having some problems. Well, what is it? Or what's the source of it? And I can't completely answer that question, but I can raise 2 points that suggest what might be happening. One, I think, very important point is that records have become, or CDs have become much less competitive to where they were 5 years ago. 5 years ago, you couldn't go into a Walmart and buy a VHS tape for the same price as a CD or a record. Today, if you happen to go into a Walmart, you'll see you can buy current movies for $15 to $16. Moreover, and again, I would like to stress Walmart because I'm going to come back to them in a second, Walmart, which is the source of about 1/3 of CD sales, pushes DVDs much more than they do, they push DVDs much more so than they do CDs. Basically, every Walmart I've ever been to, you have to walk through the video section to get to the CD section, and I don't think that's any accident. The second sort of explanation of what's going on is much of what you read in the newspaper, particularly reports from the record industry, stress shipments rather than sales, something I said in the beginning of the talk. Well, you might think that sounds just like an accounting difference, but it's not quite, and it's for the following reason. for the same period of time where the record industry has been proclaiming that their shipments have fallen, there's been a tremendous change in the industry. About a fifth and now about a quarter of sales, which used to go on at record stores, now go on at discount retailers like Walmart. The reason that's important is discount retailers like Walmart keep very lean inventories relative to record stores. So even if there's no change at all in sales, just because they keep leaner inventories, the amount of shipments that the record industry will have will fall more significantly than sales. Again, just to sort of see this in a slightly more detail, is this figure shows you, just look at the yellow and the blue line. This shows you shipments and sales from 1994 to 2003. So the information that the record industry likes to report is this yellow line, which is shipments, and you can see it fell pretty sharply. The blue line shows you sales, which is generated by another company called SoundScan, and you can see that while it went down, it didn't go down nearly as much as shipments did. So in fact, a lot of what's reported in the media, I'd argue, is just relatively sloppy reporting. People are not really looking at the difference between something as simple as sales and shipments. So the last thing I'd like to mention, and that's sort of, this is just kind of maybe as an aside, but I think it's really important given that the talk is at a law school, is that whether my results sort of stand up or not, I think one thing for sure is that file sharing is not going to disappear anytime soon, and for sure it's not going to disappear because of any legal action. And there's two reasons why I think this is true. The first one is that legal actions really haven't done much to date to dampen the growth of file sharing. So this shows you the number of file sharing users in the United States from 2002 to present, and sort of the three big legal innovations, the record industry lawsuits, their announcement, and their actual filing of them, and the Grokster case. And you can see that this isn't really what's driving changes in the number of users. The other thing that I'd like to mention is that file sharing is very, very international. And it turns out, for example, in the case of music, that over half of what US file sharing users download come from people in other countries. So if somehow magically tomorrow, through any kind of legal action, one was able to stop people in the United States from sharing any files over a file sharing network, file sharing would continue because people would still be able to download from individuals in other countries. And it suggests, unless you can somehow do a coordinated lawsuit or some kind of legal action in all the countries in the world at the same time, I don't think any kind of legal solution to file sharing will sort of ever arise. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Floor is open for questions.
Do I
Yeah, please feel free.
back and back?
BitTorrent prevents leaching, so the more people downloading, the faster it goes. And the second question is, if DVDs are pushing out CDs, then shouldn't sales of movies going up otherwise? So the differences have been lessened.
Right. Those are good questions. I'll try to put it a little bit in context for people who aren't maybe as schooled up on file sharing. There's different technologies of way these file sharing networks work, and as was suggested, the current networks basically force you to share much more so than other networks did. Our analysis basically, unfortunately, with the music, we only looked at older data prior to even basically the existence of BitTorrent. So the older stuff is just older stuff, and the newer stuff is we're primarily looking at BitTorrent. So we're not really looking at other networks. So I guess that's sort of the short answer. I'm not sure why I necessarily think the behavior is all that different on these different networks, and at least in terms of video downloads, I know for sure BitTorrent and maybe one other network, eDonkey, is kind of where most of the activity happens. I'm sorry, what was it? The second question was right. Right. Up until this year, DVDs had been really taking off. So in fact, this year, much of the decline in home video spending that I mentioned was pretty much the phasing out of the reduction in VHS sales and rentals just was a little bit bigger and slightly offset the increase in DVDs. But up until, let's see if I can even find you this slide, up until this year, let's see if I can actually get this a little bit more. Well, I'll just keep it like this. Up until this year, this is DVD revenues from like 97 to 2004. They were really growing like crazy. So this was kind of the very first year where there was any issue with the DVD market. Okay, in the back?
Record companies that are raised selling songs individually, like on iTunes, do you think they have a better case that a download is directly impacting their selling of songs over like iTunes rather than an album?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to look at that question a little bit more seriously. Let me just make maybe two passing points about iTunes. The one thing that's really surprising to me is, I think if I was running a business, the first thing I'd want to know if I was going to create a new alternative for selling my product is, how does it impact the rest of my business, and how price sensitive are my consumers? As best as I understand it, I don't think the record industry knows the answer to either of those questions. The reason that's relevant is at least some kind of very preliminary stuff I've looked at suggests to me at least that much of what goes on iTunes are not fewer people downloading on illegal file sharing networks. It's people who used to buy albums going to buy albums on iTunes. So my sort of broad sense of what goes on in iTunes is it's the music industry cannibalizing their other sales. Again, I can't really give any more details about that because I don't have any more specific information about them, but that's kind of my sense. I wouldn't view it as the glowing success that it sometimes played out to be. In the back.
I noticed in your graph of file sharing where you had the timeline where you showed the legal action, I noticed that right before the first legal action there had been a precipitous drop in file sharing. Just to the left, that first red arrow. What do you think prompted that?
That's a good question. I'm not, unfortunately, really sure. I mean, I guess the problem is also there's a lot of chattering going on sort of in that general area of when the lawsuits were announced. I mean, it's possible that there was some reaction to them, but I think maybe in some sense what's more striking to me is the Grokster case. I mean, the fact that really had, I mean, file sharing just, there was discussion right up to it and it just kept going. So, I mean, I think the big thing is I would expect if these things were going to be the solution to getting rid of file sharing, if that was your objective, this thing would have kind of gone down and stayed down. It doesn't really seem like it's done that at all. So, okay.
I actually have one comment on that and then a question. So the first comment is that it seems that almost for the first 2 summers, things either drop or plateau. So would that, or could that correlate with university students going back home where they don't have the fast connection anymore? And I guess my other question is that if I recall correctly, your first study, the one that showed that it didn't really have any effect on sales, that was done during December of 2003. Now, I mean, would that take into account the fact that people are, buying albums for other people as opposed to just for themselves?
Right. You should probably be an economist. Those are 2 points that were definitely raised to us by economists, or things that we've thought about. So let me briefly address each of them. Your first point was actually something that we've incorporated, I guess, in a probably more recent version of the paper. Your intuition is exactly right. File sharing typically drops during the summer, and I guess I probably should have said that's part of what's going on here because college kids are leaving their fast connection at school. To the extent that that's right, you might think that if the record industry story is correct, well, file sharing goes down during the summer for kind of random reasons, nothing definitely relating to demand for music. You might expect to see that the impact on record sales is a little bit diminished during the summer. And in fact, you don't see that at all. In fact, the reduction in sales during the summer is just as big as it is during every other month. So that's a good insight, and we look at that in the paper. Now, your second point is about whether looking at Christmas is a problem. Well, I guess there's 2 responses to that. The first one is well, I guess the argument is something like the following: that people wouldn't want to download something and give it as a gift or something like that. And I've actually had students give me that, maybe not as gifts, but I guess they were gifts, maybe not Christmas gifts. Well, to the extent that that's happening, I guess maybe that wasn't quite the right season to look at. But fortunately, we had enough data that this wasn't a problem. So one thing we can do is just throw out December, throw out everything after Thanksgiving, or just look at September, and we find the same kind of results. But those are both kind of really good big picture questions about thinking about whether what we're doing is wrong. And I think it should give you some of the flavor that we tried very hard to think about these issues, I think. Yeah.
You mentioned that you tried to correlate like increased downloading, I'm assuming on a particular movie or a particular song. I guess I'm curious, how did you do that? Because, as you mentioned, the fad dependency, you don't know what a movie's going to do if the download hadn't been available, so how do you...
Right. Well, let me give you an example with movies. The thing that with movies that's really fortunate for us is the way this BitTorrent network that we look at works is you actually go to a web page and you search for, say, War of the Worlds, and you type it in, and then some technology occurs, and you eventually might start getting your file. The reason this is good for us, and actually this helps almost explain how we got some of our data. We got the data for this from a Dutch computer scientist who was interested in optimizing how these networks perform. It turns out these networks don't perform very well, and that for random reasons, these networks kind of fail. And so, in other words, you'll see there are certain weekends during which we have data where either the web page fails or some of the servers fail. So basically, people who want to get movies can't get them. And why does this happen? Well, this has something to do with something with their server farm or somebody's network connection or something like that. This has nothing to do with people's demand for movies. This is just some kind of random technical glitch. And so that's the kind of random variation that we are exploiting in terms of the movies, these kind of technological issues that just have something to do with file sharing but don't really have much to do with the specific nature of people's demand for movies. So I hope that seems like a pretty good sort of that's basically what we're doing. Jamie. Yeah.
So I really enjoyed it. Two questions. Obviously, after you produced it, there were some critiques, econometric and other critiques that were produced. I guess Witz had some and others. Of the criticisms made, which ones are there any that you thought were, had some substance to them? Did you try to design your new study to avoid problems that you thought were correctly? And then the other one is, when you talk privately to people in record companies, they often put their goals differently than the peer-to-peer networks are destroying our business. What they say is, what we're looking for is enough of a lag between the availability of peer-to-peer technology and us moving to a new model. Enough sort of grit thrown into the wheels of whether it's through law, through things like the DMCA, through publicity, through spoofing, seeding networks with bad files, whatever, just so that we can persuade people to move to our alternative technology. And the old example I'm sure you've heard is the bottled water thing. They say you can't compete with free. Well, clearly you can compete with free, provided people think that the free stuff is contaminated or not as high quality or not as convenient and so forth. So the second question is, so they presented as kind of, this is a holding action, right? Maybe we're exaggerating a little bit, but we needed to because it was a real threat. But what we really want is to make this transition. Maybe we are cannibalizing ourselves, but we have to make this transition. So the second question is, do you have any thought on whether or not they're going to be able to make that transition successfully from your data?
Well, I'll address them, I guess, in order. This slide lists, I think if I sort of could summarize like the critiques we got, there'd be about 50 of them that we got. Sort of my sort of stock phrase is we got 1,000 unsolicited referee reports on our paper. I think one very consistent one, and I think a very good criticism of the music study, which I don't think is going to be as relevant for the movie studies, what might be called the dropout hypothesis. And it's something like the following. We only have data for, say, 4 or 5 months. But maybe what's going on is that what's driving the problems with the record industry is people, once they become downloaders, they sort of stop buying music. And so sort of what's really driving this is the long-term growth in the number of people who are becoming file-sharing users. Now, I probably don't want to dwell with exactly, we spent a lot of time thinking about this problem. I mean, I guess the 2 quick responses I have to that is it's just not at all consistent with people's behavior. In other words, if you look at people and say, people who are heavy downloaders, do you continue to buy music or not? Because this says they don't. That's not at all true. People who download music are very heavy music buyers. I'm not saying that that's a causality, but that just seems to be a matter of fact. Secondly, you can kind of take some of our results and look at sort of long-term, longer-term information. So you might, for example, under this hypothesis or almost any hypothesis, think that, for example, genres of music that are not heavily downloaded should see a smaller reduction in sales. So country music turns not to be very heavily downloaded, it turns out. But their trends in sales are not all that different from other genres of music. Again, I think we basically, I mean, a lot of, I guess this was 2003 and 2004, a lot of my 2004 was spent doing the slide, basically. So we have a lot of criticisms, and I think we've tried our best to address all of them, and I haven't really found one that, at least in my opinion, has really stuck. Your second question is about, what the record industry has done, and whether this kind of makes sense, whether they're going to be able to successfully move to what comes next. I can't really say because I don't have access. I don't know everything that they're doing. I'm a little skeptical. I'm skeptical because when I look at the things that they do in terms of what are their new models that they're putting out, things like iTunes, as I said before, I don't think they're doing, for example, if Amazon was doing this, Amazon would say, oh, I better find out how price sensitive my consumers are. I better find out where my consumers are coming from. Amazon does these kinds of experiments. The music industry doesn't do it. And I mean, maybe they'll do it in 5 years, I don't know, but I don't know why it would take them 5 years to figure this out. I mean, I'm not a businessman. It seems pretty obvious enough to me. But sort of another spin on what you said is also, we sort of slow things down a little bit with the hope that this buys us some time. In fact, I think this has kind of had a boomerang effect in some sense because they've done this several times. So the record industry, for example, pushed out Napster, and then in came Kazaa, and then they've pushed out Kazaa basically. Now there are other alternatives. Every time that they do this, they make it harder for themselves in the future to ever kind of get rid of this competitor that they view this file sharing as. So in other words, every time Napster had this really convenient property for the record industry that it was a server farm located outside San Francisco, it would be something that would be relatively easy to control legally and otherwise. Kazaa was not in the United States anymore, a little bit harder to take care of. The new thing that people are working on are either fully or semi-anonymous networks. Every time the record industry tries to buy a little bit of time, I think they're kind of making the competitor a little bit stronger, and I'm wondering whether that really makes a lot of sense in terms of the long haul. Yeah.
How true do you think the results hold for downloading of television shows as well, since those are some of the most popular downloads, I think, and at the same time they're just collector's items really that people have already seen the show, or they buy the whole DVD set, which they could download easily.
Right, that's a good question. We haven't explicitly looked at TV shows at all, and TV shows, of course, are a bit different from movies in the sense that at least NBC and some networks have started selling their shows on iTunes, so there's a sort of different industry structure than movies where, by and large, they're, at least for all intents and purposes, really aren't legal downloads. I think, just as you said, I mean, there's definitely enough differences between TV and movies that I wouldn't necessarily want to draw inferences from what we have to TV shows, and hopefully at some point we'll get to look at TV shows too, but we haven't done that yet. Yeah.
Well, I have two questions. The first is, have you sort of looked at or accounted for multiple downloads, like you were talking about quality, like people searching for a certain quality? Have you accounted, okay, they had to download it 10 times before they got one that they kept?
Well, we tried to, with our music data, we would do that. In other words, and our music data was a little bit different from our movie data in the sense that we would follow specific individuals, and we would see exactly as you said. We'd see people either downloading something and maybe it was bad quality or it was spoofed or something was wrong with it, and we would see them do it again. If we observed that, we would. Well, we did it both ways. We would, in our sort of main analysis, we would count it as one download, but we also said, well, maybe, who knows, maybe they really like it and want to have different versions. It turns out one of the things that was very difficult in this is people use very creative naming conventions for their files, so it was sometimes difficult to tell. It might be a remix or something like that that we weren't aware of. So anyway, we looked at it both ways.
And with, the second question is, with movies, Do you think that part of sort of the difference between music and movie downloading is sort of the theater experience, rather than, you know, you have a song, you can listen to it wherever and it's the same thing?
Right. That's a really good point, and that sort of was, I think, our main reason that we wanted to look at movies after we'd already looked at music, is that they do seem to be different products. And you're right. I mean, not only like in the case of War of the Worlds, even if you got the DVD copy, I don't imagine sitting there and watching War of the Worlds on my laptop is the same as being in the theater with the sound and stuff like that. We might think it's more of a substitute for people buying the DVD months later, but you're right. At least in terms of the box office, I would think people who are really interested in seeing the movie, I wouldn't really think the download copy is a great substitute. That's a good point. Yeah.
It seems here that on a couple of points that I'm not sure either the movie industry and maybe even in your study you're fully identifying who the competitor is. Maybe it's not the free, but maybe it's the new. I mean, one of the things that's sort of conspicuously absent from this study is the intersection between new technologies, iPod, and piracy. And Steve Jobs is now in conversations with Pixar. You see sort of a confluence of, well, there may be some sort of loss on some sort of content, and you're also seeing a real spike in the value and in profits in some of the hardware ends. So I wonder, is the competitor really these peer-to-peer networks, or is it just sort of the new and moving towards that and then moving away to it and then to the new again?
Right. No, that's a good point, and I guess two comments. In terms of our music study, for good or for worse, that was long enough ago that iTunes wasn't very important, so probably at that point that was the new thing. But sort of your bigger point, which is a good one, is that, I mean, it definitely seems like these new innovations, whether it's file sharing or iTunes, that, you know, whether one should distinguish between them and thinking about their impact on physical sales of CDs is not at all obvious to me. You know, to follow up on one small point you had said, I mean, among the sort of very few people who do seem to have been very happy with our study was the Consumer Electronics Association, who include, among other things, are the people who make the MP3 players. And they were pretty happy about what we had ended up finding. So there are at least some small groups. But I think the broad point about, you know, whether it's file sharing or just these new alternatives is a great question that I wish we could think of a good way of sort of analyzing that in a broader way. I guess we don't have a lot to say about it, but I think that's a good point.
I think on that note, we have to draw it to a close because we're past our time. Let's give Professor Strumpf a round of applause.